You are live.
Well, good evening. This is Gary Borgendale, and welcome to the forum. This is a collaboration from the First Tuesday Conservatives and Alpha News. And tonight we're going to be talking about the future of the Republican Party. And so we're going to be talking about that both on the national and the state of Minnesota. So first of all, let me introduce myself a little bit. I am the local ministry director for AM 980 The Mission. That's a Christian talk and teaching radio station here in the Twin Cities, along with our partner stations, AM 1280 The Mission, 1570 our Freedom Station, and Salem Surround. And so it's my opportunity to guest host this evening, and we have two great guests that are joining us. And the first one is Branden Petersen. And Branden, why don't you go and introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll go to our next guest, AJ, after you're done, Branden. So go ahead and introduce yourself, Branden.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Appreciate that. Thanks to the First Tuesday Conservatives and Alpha News for the opportunity and invite to come on. Father of four and husband, live in Andover and served 2 terms as a Republican legislator in the State House and State Senate.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Branden. And AJ, please introduce yourself and a little bit about your background.
My name is AJ Kaufman. I live up here in St. Cloud in the Granite City. Married, have lived in Minnesota for about 8 years now, lived in a few states before that, including the People's Republic of California. I'm a journalist at this point in my life, off and on for the past 15 years. Before that, I was also a historian and a public school teacher in Los Angeles.
So you must have escaped Los Angeles to come to Minnesota. How did that happen?
Indirectly. I went from coast to coast and then kind of matriculated my way west from the East Coast in Indiana and Nebraska, and then settled here along the tundra.
Well, good. Well, welcome. Well, let's kind of jump into this because we've had a lot of changes here in our politics. And so let's kind of jump in onto the national scale. And usually I look at 3 to 5 issues that are really kind of paramount that provide direction for where a party might go. And I think one of the things I'll just kind of start out on is the whole issue of immigration. And so I'll kind of let Branden, why don't you go ahead and start out with that and see where you see immigration, if that is an issue for us in the Republican Party and way it goes into the future.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think immigration is one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with. Obviously, if we remember back to 2016 at the launch of Donald Trump's campaign, riding down the golden escalator, he really launched his campaign around immigration. And I think was the primary reason that he was able to capture the support of the Republican base. And frankly, the middle class, the working class folks in middle America who have largely felt the economic effects of sort of the laissez-faire immigration policies that we've seen since the mid-90s. If we are to live up to this realignment that we've seen as a working class party, we're really going to need to embrace immigration, a populist immigration policy that is pro-worker, that puts American workers first, that is recognizes, you know, oftentimes we talk about immigration in the context of the humane or the humanity element. And that's often the foil that's used by the left to talk about this issue. But that's really something that we can speak to as well, because Americans deserve the opportunity to make a decent living. And immigration is one of those issues that allows Americans first to prosper, as well as recent immigrants. You know, the people who are most victimized by the economic displacement of open and illegal immigration and mass immigration or mass amnesty are those recent immigrants who are likely competing with jobs in those very same fields that these newcomers are competing in. So it's absolutely critical. I think, frankly, President Trump won in 2016 based on this issue, and maybe lost a little bit of support due to the fact that he wasn't as hawkish as he promised he would be throughout his first term. So it's an absolutely critical issue, and it's one that that we need to continue to focus on if we're going to continue to.
Yeah, and I think with that too is that with President Trump, he was very effective in lessening that immigration into the United States, and probably he didn't speak about it enough that way. And one of those success stories that he had as well. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump over to AJ, and you give me your insights relative to how you see immigration as one of those policies for the Republicans going forward.
Well, first off, I would not argue that it's his immigration platform during the 2015-2016 primaries, more so than even the general election. That's why Donald Trump got the nomination. Having a 17-person field and standing out with that sort of populist mentality didn't hurt. As far as how effective he was, you could argue he was very effective because it was not an issue that was talked about as much as most people assumed it would be, especially on the right and in the center, probably in the 2020 election. I don't recall, I could be wrong, a single question in the 3 presidential debates about it, or in the 2 presidential debates, or in the vice presidential debate. The Democrats may have talked about it, but they're coming at it from a totally different angle. And it's interesting whether or not that cost him. I don't know. You know, there were 5 states that flipped that Trump won in 2016 that he did not carry in 2020. You'd have to find out individually where people ranked immigration as a policy. You can look at how he scored among working class people versus amongst suburban women or people like that, and judge it. We have stats to look at for all that. But I would say that I don't know how big an issue it is amongst overall voters. I just don't. I'm not a dove on the issue. I think like anyone, I believe in strong borders. I'm okay with the wall, though 300-400 miles have been built. I think it could be looked at as symbolic now. You can hear the argument that Trump himself and his policies were the wall. We have incredible border agents in this country, heroes, I would call them, for what they do each day. And you know, there are people who are hardcore on this, and I think they're consistent on the immigration hawk side that are disappointed that it wasn't talked about more. And you know, we know columnists like that, Ann Coulter, people like that. So it's not my number one issue, but I certainly understand the appeal, and I think it did help him win in 2016.
One of the things that I have noticed that those that come to the United States and become naturalized citizens, boy, their passion for this country is so strong. It kind of puts us that have been born here to shame, because that, you know, they made America their choice. And then when they were chosen to be citizens, it's like, okay, this is really big deal. And so it's exciting to see that. And I think it's an encouragement for us to really continue to pursue that immigration that really fits to those people that desire to come here and make a difference for themselves and a difference for our country that way.
Well, and I think, Gary, just to piggyback on that point, I mean, when you look at the particular, I mean, there's much has been made of Trump's performance with Latinos and with the Black community in the last election. And that sort of was counterintuitive to the mainstream sort of leftist media talking point about how this all was going to shake out. Trump was supposedly going to face a reckoning with these communities because of these policies. You actually look at congressional districts along the Rio Grande Valley, you look at the performance in Florida, and you look at public polling for recent Latino immigrants and the Black community, and actually they're much more supportive of restrictionist immigration policies than even they are for the generic Republican Party or Republican candidates. And so I think it absolutely needs to continue to be a focus for that reason, but also because white middle-class working families are also dependent on it and largely supported the issue.
Right. One other point on there I'll make is that I'm a demographics guy. And so it requires 2.2 or 2.1, 2.2 births per woman to maintain a civilization. And currently the white population is about 1.7. And so without the Latinos, we would have been in a country of decline. And so it's important for us to have that immigration that reflects that birth rate that continue to maintain and grow our civilization that way.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes, go ahead, AJ.
I'm married to an immigrant from Colombia. legal citizen, became a citizen 10 years ago, proud American, as is the rest of her family. So I totally agree with you on the emphasizing legal immigration and the need for immigrants, especially because of population replacement, fertility rates, those kind of things that are declining, fertility rates in particular. Highly educated immigrants provide what I would call much needed technical support, medical assistance, immigrant doctors and nurses in the cities and in rural areas. And of course, it's different than refugee resettlement, which we might touch on in the Minnesota segment. And obviously, while on the one hand, I know plenty of Latinos like Branden was describing who are very strong on the border, but I also know some who came here legally, who are upper middle class, who are extremely left wing on the border, even if they're not from Mexico. They could be from Europe, they could be from India, they could be from other parts of Latin America. So it's a tough situation. And then you factor in the suburban vote, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But while you're right that African Americans, some Latinos, Asian Americans, whatever demographic you look at, and of course, working class white Americans, look for a strong border, it's the more educated suburban people, and especially women, have been turned off by it. That's not my opinion. That just shows up in the stats. Trump did okay with them in 2016, interestingly, but this past month, he did not do as well with suburban women. Suburban men, he was fine, as far as I recall. But Republican women in the suburbs are not as hard line as most Americans and as their husbands, even when it comes to immigration. And part of that probably comes from the media. There's a psychological aspect when you see coverage of the kids in cages, which of course we all know took place under Barack Obama's administration. He built the cage.
Or the lifeboats.
Right. But what exactly? But what percent of people that are voting realize that those were created in 2014, those cages? Right. I don't know. Not many if they're getting their news in certain areas.
So kind of to wrap up on immigration, of what I'm hearing both of you say is that basically pursue the policies of Donald Trump, legal immigration, the border is walls, secure the borders is still a good idea, and be welcoming to immigrants that come into this country legally.
I would say that's
I wouldn't entirely endorse that statement. I actually think that part of Donald Trump's promise was actually not just illegal immigration, but a restriction of legal immigration as well. I think if you're thinking about a working class policy that works for the people who currently live here, and I'm not talking race necessarily exclusively, I'm just talking about Americans in general. I think you have to look at the middle and upper class ramifications of H-1B visa programs and other things that are absolutely critical to maintaining an American citizenry that has access to high quality jobs. I don't think illegal immigration is the only issue. And as a matter of fact, we've seen a lot of pushback just very recently within the last week regarding the Senate's action and I believe Senator Mike Lee's introduction to as an amendment to a bill that would basically open up the floodgates for H-1B visa applicants in this country. And I think we would be remiss if we strictly focused on illegal immigration. The fact is that that in terms of a populist economic platform, legal immigration and illegal immigration are both critical policy points. And the reason is simple. Because whether you lost your job due to illegal immigration or whether you lost your job due to legal immigration, you still don't have a job.
Lost your job.
Today. And that's really the only thing that matters to people. And really, we've realized sort of the folly of globalization over the last few years, and Donald Trump gets a lot of credit for bringing that issue forward. But I think in a lot of ways, we didn't do enough on both fronts during Trump's administration. And I think that's why he lost some support from some of the people who voted for him in 2016.
AJ, any more comments before we move on?
Not much. I would just say you may be correct overall on that, Branden, but it's going to be a hard sell. And I know things that are important can be hard sells, but if you've got an entire party on one side, the Democrats, you've got moderate Republicans, and then you've even got some business Republicans, some Mike Lee types, others that are all going to be tough on that, questioning that. It's going to be a difficult haul, especially with the Democrat president. And that, of course, is why the Senate race in Georgia is so important coming up in about 4 weeks. But I'm ready to move on.
No question, it's going to be difficult. Absolutely.
Let's move on. The Republican Party was founded on two moral issues, anti-slavery and anti-polygamy. And that's one of those social issues that is really prominent now, especially in the suburbs, on equity, progressivism, abortion rights. How does the Republican Party deal with those issues going forward and the push that is coming from the progressive left on those different issues? AJ, I'm going to start out with you on kind of the moral issues, if you will, facing the Republicans.
It's a difficult question because you have a triumvirate of the media, of academia, and of Hollywood and even big tech that are going to be pushing one way on that. And that's very difficult to overcome because every American comes across one of those or more than one of those entities every day in their life. There is no conservative bubble. I've long said that. That may have been coined by someone else, but you could live in the most rural part of Wyoming and just go to church on Sundays and work from home. You still cannot live in a conservative bubble. A liberal bubble is the easiest thing in the world to live in. And I don't need to elaborate on that, but we all have friends and family that have never met a conservative or have never turned on Fox News or have never read a conservative website because they're surrounded by people and media outlets and schools that, and everything from billboards to sports that push one way. So it's difficult. I would just add that it's an ongoing question. It's always going to be, but we just don't know what the world's going to look like in 2022 or 2024. Needless to say, 11 months ago, we didn't know there was going to be a global pandemic.
Right.
We don't know if Joe Biden is going to be alive in 2024. We don't know if he is alive. I hope he, by the way, full disclosure, I pray for the man every day because the other option is the scariest thing imaginable. We don't know if he'll run for a second term. We don't know if he'll pass the torch to the authoritarian vice president he's chosen. We don't know whether we'll be at war in a different way than we are now. We don't know who will control the Senate, obviously, or the House. We don't know if there'll be more Supreme Court justices. We don't know what the national mood will be like, and we don't know, frankly, who's going to be alive. And I hate to say it like that, but with close to 300,000 dead in the past 10 months, we don't know who's going to be alive. And I mean that in a general sense. So before we get into 2024, I just, and future of the Republican Party in suburbia or wherever else, there's so many aspects that are to be determined.
Okay, very good. Branden?
Well, I mean, the good news for the populist right, the new right, whatever you want to call it, is that the majority of voters, or at least a plurality of voters in this country versus every other segment, is culturally right, socially right of center, and economically populist, an economic centrist. That it makes up, by most public opinion examinations of the US population, the largest voting bloc. Roughly 40% of the American population would identify in that manner. Republicans need to address social issues and cultural issues, because what we've done to this point, and in my own experience, I'm as much at fault as anybody else, is attempted to conserve the status quo. And at a certain point in conservatism, we need to ask ourselves, what in fact have we conserved? What have we been successful in conserving? And this requires an entire change in mindset in terms of how we address social issues in this country. The good news is that on the abortion front, for example, that isn't a lost cause by any stretch of the imagination. It is still very much an issue that's in play, where if we have effective messaging, we can win, and we ought to, and we have to. Otherwise, we lose the moral authority to run as a major party in this country, period. But there's also other issues. In the last presidential debate, I believe, Joe Biden was asked a question about sex changes for 8-year-olds and whether or not that was appropriate. Now, we talk about issues with suburban women, for example, and we talk about issues for families and people who care primarily. If you ask a suburban woman, what's her number one priority? It's her family and it's her
And
children.
education.
And
Education.
education, but even before education, it's education because it's her children. So her children are first. I don't think that that's an issue. In fact, I know it's an issue that mainstream Americans support. We need to come out forcefully against those things, not just attempting to block legislation to allow for reassignment surgeries for 8-year-olds, God forbid, but actually talk about this is what our opposition believes in.
Right.
We also need to talk about one of the biggest issues in this country is the sex trade. And we've talked, human trafficking has gotten a ton of traction over the last few years, and it's great that it has. And oftentimes that conversation's around the illicit sex trafficking industry. But we have to ask ourselves a question. What is the moral difference? The moral difference, I'm not talking about the legal or regulatory difference, between that industry and the legal sex trade that is basically overtaken our culture. And I'm talking about the pornographic industry.
Pornography.
I'm talking about the fact that today, if you have a 17-year-old daughter, she can become an adult film star through a company called OnlyFans the moment she becomes 18. This is an absolute epidemic in our culture. And we need to begin to speak to the fact that this isn't going to change until we start identifying that this is a broken morality, regardless of whether or not you have the appropriate permit or pay the appropriate taxes or have the appropriate regulatory certifications. And right now we're not doing it. And until, you say, well, we're losing the culture war. Well, we're losing the culture war because there's nobody who's properly opposing these issues in the public forum. People will point to public polling it, well, that's not a priority. Well, it becomes a priority when a major party, when a major elected official, when someone running a statewide campaign or a national campaign decides to plant their flag on that issue. And I can tell you that regardless of whether you're a liberal or a conservative or whatever your identification is, if you have a son or daughter, you do not want them to end up being in the legal sex trade or the illegal sex trade. And I don't care who you talk to. So we need to begin to address these issues head on. And I can tell you that most of the people watching this, I'm probably the first person who's spoken to this issue. Their elected Republican officials aren't speaking to this issue. Right. And until we start to do that, we're not going to win this culture war, because it in a war requires an opposition. And until we have an opposition, we're lost.
Yeah, and I really want to tag on to what both you said. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and so God's truth is very real to me. And so when we talk about abortion, one of the things we do see is that the younger generation, the millennials, are increasingly supportive of that. And so I think when, Branden, you're talking about that support, but I even look at it a broader issue. I look at the life issue as one of those in the womb, special needs, and the elderly. And especially as you look at some of the things going on of COVID, that importance of life is a very important one. I also say that, a lot of my friends and the Republicans are more concerned with the economics. And yes, the economics are important, but without a moral foundation, you certainly will not have a nation in the future. So it is important for that moral foundation, I believe, to take place. And it's quite interesting is that we've said, okay, we can go ahead and have recreational marijuana, yet we're then saying, well, as a child that is 8 years old can have a sex change, and yet we say, well, you have to be 21 to drink alcohol. I mean,
it's insane.
It just makes no sense to this. And we need to protect these children out there from these drastic surgeries, and the parent needs to be the parent. Guys, anything else more we want to talk about on the moral issues? And Brandon, I think you're very correct on it. The history of the Republican Party is that how it began very strongly on slavery and being opposed to it. And that's what caused the election of Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president. So I think it's very true. One of the things I've learned the hard way is you can't make those changes politically. You have to make those changes culturally. And I think the Christian church is in the best place to make those changes on a cultural basis.
I would only add in,
Good.
so I'm not a Christian. I'm Jewish. Happy Hanukkah. Tonight's the first night of Hanukkah.
Is it tonight or is it tomorrow night?
Yeah, it actually about an hour ago it began.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. You can't see the menorah, but it's back there somewhere.
Looks like a Christmas tree back there.
It's up there too, but that's not on tonight because we're going to do Hanukkah.
Okay.
So you're correct, Brandon. The irony of all this is that if you watch sports, watch late night talk show, whatever it might be, everyone says they're a fiscal conservative and a social liberal. That's like the most common thing you hear. It's the easiest thing to be. I'm fiscally conservative because I'm rich, I'm on TV, and I'm socially liberal because I want to be accepted and not called a bigot, basically. When in reality, we learned in the past 4 or 5 years, although it's been the case for a while, that you're correct. More Americans are socially conservative and fiscally moderate, liberal, populist, whatever you want to call it. And that's something that Donald Trump is no conservative when it comes to spending.
That's correct.
I don't think some Republicans are, and they'll criticize him for that, just like they criticized George W. Bush for spending. And some Republicans have given up worrying about spending. And that's a whole different discussion. But you're right on the culture. I think the conservatives and the Republican Party have it correct. It's just hard to get the message out. And I hate to say it, but President Trump is probably not the best person to get the message out because of his background. He tried as best he could. It's probably hard for people who are not Trump loyalists to take him seriously on the social issues, even though his actions on abortion and some of the other aspects have been conservative or good. But you're right about parents. They want a conservative culture, a moral culture, and schooling. And I'll just close with this. I'm a former teacher, inner city Los Angeles. I have teachers in the family. I try not to get too partisan, but what the Democrat Party has done to the schools in our major cities is a catastrophe. And their opposition to charter schools, when they're able to send their kids to private schools, people I know in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and yet they won't let poor and minority groups send their kids to charter schools and they have to stay in failing schools. It's not just hypocritical, it's catastrophic and inexcusable. And that's an area of the Republican Party. Betsy DeVos was a good choice. She got some things accomplished. Unfortunately, there's going to be a new education secretary who's probably going to undo most of that. And that also goes to some of the moral things that you mentioned, including what's going on college campuses, which is a whole nother topic.
Mm-hmm. We can go there. Brandon?
Well, I mean, the difference, though, that I would advocate is a difference in posture. I mean, conservatism and the conservative mainline Republican conservatism has been focused on a defensive posture for decades. Right. What we're going to do as a movement is, and this is the status quo, is we're going to wait for the next crazy idea from the left, and then we're going to try to defeat that. And what we need to do, and this is the part of national populism that I think is critical to understand in terms of understanding how we can use the levers of our elected power through the people that we send into these elected positions, is that we need to take an affirmative position in our institutions. We need to actually attempt to change the curriculum in a way that's in line with our values.
Right.
Because if we don't do it, what we've seen is that our kids suddenly will be reading books about how cops kill Black people all the time indiscriminately, or how, little Timmy wanted to become Sarah, or whatever the case may be. This whole, conservatives, and I understand it comes from a good place. It comes from an ideological place. It sort of has this libertarian genesis.
do no
that we're
harm.
going to take our hands off and the localities and the people and the invisible hand of the market, whatever the case may be, is going to take care of all these issues. And what we've found is that actually what that has done is just allowed the left to run roughshod over academia, over entertainment, sports, culture, the bureaucracy. We need an affirmative, culturally rightist position that affirms what we know is true. And we need to do that in an unabashed way. And until we do that, we're going to continue to lose, because any battle, any war where one side simply defends and chooses and lets it be known they'll never aggress is going to lose ground over time. And we need to change our entire posture. And I don't blame Donald Trump entirely. He was elected as a generational change agent without much bench in the bureaucracy, in intelligentsia, in the elected class. But we need to continue to build on that movement, and we need to cast a culturally conservative, rightist, whatever you want to say, nationalist vision. And then we can begin to push back against what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 decades.
Guys, we need to move along here a little bit more. And, we've talked about just the components of immigration, talking about some of the culture issues. I think we need to address foreign policy, especially what we see with China and some of the things that are coming into the news today. And, my support for Israel as well. I think that's very important. So I'm going to start out with Branden. Some thoughts are where we go. Do we go more isolationist? Do we go more of a globalistic policeman? Or how do you see a foreign policy for the United States going forward?
Well, I think we've got to prioritize, look, a nation exists for the benefit of its own people, right? Without which there's no reason for nationhood. And so when we think about, American foreign policy, we've got to view everything through that lens. The decision to focus on domestic policy first is, in fact, a foreign policy decision. That doesn't mean that we withdraw entirely from unilateral relationships or multilateral relationships throughout the world. Of course, diplomacy is critical. We live in a world, whether we like it or not, that has significant globalist ties, markets and cultures and interactions through various channels are all relevant to everyone, more so than they've ever been. But what we've seen over the last few decades is a Republican, really a uniparty sentiment that it says that it is the responsibility of young men from rural America to fly off to places they've never heard of and risk their lives, risk their blood, and risk our treasure to defend some abstract concept of, I don't know, freedom or democracy or whatever the case may be. And I think the American public is largely opposed to that sort of willy-nilly foreign adventurism that we've seen. And I can only think of some recent examples. There's a discussion right now in the incoming Biden administration about defending freedom in Belarus, for example. Quite frankly, my kids haven't went to school all year. My church hasn't had in-person service for 6 out of the last 8 months. We've got some significant freedom-related issues right here at home before we start worrying about exporting democracy. And by the way,
where is Belarus?
It's Eastern Europe.
I know, but it's like, okay,
right, exactly.
Who knows where it is?
We're talking about exporting democracy and on the basis because some guy named Lukashenko supposedly won an illegitimate election, when I've got a guy who was just elected based on data that is several standard deviations from what is even remotely probable. Okay. I haven't been able to go, people aren't able to go to work. My kids can't go to school. And the governor of my state told me I couldn't go to my parents' house on Thanksgiving. And I'm getting ready to send, American military again to some country called Belarus to defend freedom. It's preposterous. And I think the American people are intently focused on what's best for us. And again, preserving relationships that are important, preserving defense pacts that are important, and maintaining those things, I don't think is mutually exclusive to reining in some of these preposterous foreign adventure.
AJ, you wanted to jump in there with some comments. AJ, go ahead, please.
Well, yeah, it's a cliche, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. No one's
Let me
sending.
just take a time out here, though. We do want to say if you do have any questions that you would feel free to go to the chat and enter those questions in, and whoever you would like to answer that question, we would be happy to respond to those as well. So my apologies, AJ, go ahead, please.
There's a lot of talk. You hear it on cable news, on Fox, especially Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham. There's a lot of straw men discussions going on. Tucker Carlson said a year ago, I'm not sending my son to die in Montenegro. He was talking about NATO, I suppose. There's a lot of this far left and far right coalescing around an anti-war isolationist platform. First of all, I think it's telling that Republicans now sound like John Kerry in 2004 or the anti-war movement from 2003 to 2008. That's not a party I want to be part of. I'm not, no one's pro-war, but I'm not retreating. And I agree with you that we can't be everywhere. But again, no one's going to Belarus or Montenegro. Okay. They've been saying that they said that John McCain wanted to bomb Iran in 2006. No one's bombing Iran. There's a lot of straw men going on here. Our military is very, very deliberate in what they do, including under the Trump administration. We don't go on adventurism, at least we haven't since, if you want to talk about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which were successful initially. And I think people forget how successful they were, miraculously successful. And then, there's a whole political dynamic after that. Right. And then, Barack Obama became president and sacrificed all of our gains, in my opinion, in Iraq especially. But I don't want to be part of a movement that's aligned with Bernie Sanders on foreign policy. And I saw these people the other day on Fox News, Matt Gaetz, others bonding with AOC and Ro Khanna of California, and Ingraham and Carlson supporting that idea that we're going to have a united movement from the far left and far right to oppose United States foreign policy and weaken our standing abroad. The United States we're not Belarus in the sense that we are the world superpower, and the world's policeman is another line that is tossed around. If we were really the world's policeman, we'd be in every country. We're not. We've had troops in Germany for 60, 70 years, and yet we can't have a couple thousand troops keeping the peace in the Middle East in the most volatile region. So I think there's a lot of agreement that I have with Branden in some ways and with the poor populist wing, but I think some of it is obscured and is too broad and comes off a little bit, it's a little hyperbolic and a little bit of mixing, attributing concepts and beliefs to people that really don't have them. And of course, it all emanates from people getting tired of being at war. And I understand that.
Fatigue.
At war, tired of being at war. At war is arguably geopolitically the most significant state that anybody could be in. So
are we at war right now, though? Are we at war?
Yeah, yes. Unfortunately, we are. I mean, we have American military that are in Somalia. We have American military that are in Iraq. We have American military that are in Afghanistan. And for the families who have lost their sons or daughters in these states, you have to ask why did we do that?
They did volunteer.
We've toppled and destroyed the Libyan stability.
Well, that was Libya.
Toppled and destroyed any stability that was in Syria. We have literally went for a century or close to it on foreign policy endeavors. And at the end of the day, the American people are being asked to pay for these things in treasure, of course, a great amount of it, but also in the lives of their sons and daughters. And at some point, somebody's got to say, well, what did we get for that? What did we gain?
We got 19 years since 9/11 without a terror attack on our soil.
I mean, but you
That's the
talk
truth.
about logical fallacies. That doesn't prove anything.
It doesn't prove
Well,
anything. We
I
lost.
think there's a lot of truth.
In the
Go
Iraq
ahead,
War.
AJ. AJ, go ahead, please.
I always go back to that. And I used to talk about this with the left, and now I seem to talk about it as much or more with the right. Don't discount, you may not like the Patriot Act. You may not like certain things that happen. You may not like the FBI or the CIA. Suddenly conservatives don't like the FBI and the CIA because Donald Trump it doesn't like certain things that have happened. And don't get me wrong, there's been some nefarious things going on in the FBI at the top. But this idea that we can just sit back and act like we didn't expect there to be several 9/11s after it happened. And that's not a credit to the men and women who volunteered, including friends of yours and friends of mine, I'm sure, and family members, to go fight in these wars and keep our country safe. And, from the moral perspective, we are conservatives, last I checked. We do believe, we just had a whole discussion about morals, and yet we don't seem to think it's important for other countries to have democracy and be free from tyranny and from totalitarian, fanatical, misogynistic Islamic terrorists around the world or elsewhere. I just think it's a moral issue too. And as far as the money goes, yeah, we could always cut, but do you want to cut from defense when we could cut from so many other places?
We've spent trillions of dollars.
Gentlemen, I need to jump in here a little bit.
That have been used to benefit the many people in 2008 who lost their homes, and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have lost their livelihoods in this country. And everybody who's elected in this country has swore an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution and look out for the interests of their constituents, not
Gentlemen,
the people
I need to jump in here, Branden.
World War II started too by being
Sure.
isolated.
Yeah, I need to jump in here a little bit. We are not having an opportunity to talk about what I believe is one of the biggest issues is China and their influence going forward. We'll have to pick that up on the next time. By the way, I am Gary Borgendale, and I'm stepping in as host tonight for First Tuesday Conservatives. That's our partnership with First Tuesday Conservatives and Alpha News. So thank you for both of those organizations for putting this together. And tonight we have Branden Petersen on with us and AJ Kaufman. Branden is a former state legislator, and AJ Kaufman is a writer for Alpha News and writer for a lot of other things as well. And so we've been talking about some of the issues from the national standpoint. We're going to switch gears for a little bit here. We don't have a lot of time to talk about the Republican Party here in Minnesota. And first of all, I just want to hit on a couple things of the last election. What was done right, what went wrong, maybe 3 points of what was the good, what was the bad, what was the ugly. And so, Branden, since you're a former state Republican office holder, why don't you go first and say, here in Minnesota, what went right, where are the Republicans relative to the Democrats, so we can kind of get an idea of the lay of the land here in Minnesota.
Yeah, I think overall Republicans can be pleased with the results that we saw here in Minnesota. I think what you've seen in Minnesota is similar to what we've seen nationally in terms of a political realignment. Republicans now overwhelmingly represent Greater Minnesota. It's a party of Greater Minnesota, and I think that fits with the socially conservative and economic populist message that we have shifted to over the last 4 years. Obviously, holding the Minnesota Senate was absolutely critical.
Big deal.
And a huge win. Somewhat unexpected was also the significant gains in the Minnesota House. We also defeated a longtime incumbent in Branden Petersen in the 7th District. Overwhelmingly, really, Michelle Fischbach wiped the floor with Branden Petersen. And we won in the 1st, which has historically been a very difficult and competitive district to win. And Tom Emmer won going away in a district that Michelle Bachmann not too long ago won by only a few points.
Right.
So I think what you're seeing is that the reddening of everybody outside of that little blue donut in Minneapolis
and Ramsey
and Hennepin County and Ramsey County particularly. And I think overall it was a positive development. I think what we've got to continue to do is figure out a way to turn out more of our own voters. I think there's a lot of conversation about how do we win moderate suburban moms, for example. That's sort of the topic du jour. And really, not to dismiss them, I think they're important. But I think that when you look at the majority, 10% of 40% is more than 10% of 20%, right? So when we look at our electorate, we look at the 45% of people who voted for Donald Trump, and we think about how do we deliver policies that are going to speak to moms, but also working class Minnesotans across the board. I think we've got some work to do. I'll use an issue right now, for example, and this is a difference between the old Republicans and the new Republican mindset that I think we ought to take. Right now, there's a bill before the Minnesota legislature where we're talking, Republicans are at odds with Democrats about whether we do small business relief for COVID or whether we do small business relief and unemployment insurance extensions for those who are unemployed. Republicans have got to get on board with supporting families and supporting working people with that unemployment insurance extension, whereas in the old days, that was a topic that we would have often voted against because we were going to support the business side, but we weren't going to support the UI extension. That's a mentality change that needs to happen. But overall, I think it was a good election for Republicans. I think it's promising, and I think we're right on the cusp of taking majorities in both chambers.
AJ, go ahead, please.
Well, like I said, I've only lived here about 8 years. I don't fancy myself as much of an expert on state politics as national. Obviously, Brandon's correct. The Republicans now represent greater Minnesota. I think the president won, 90% of the counties again. If you look at the land area, I'm sure the Republicans represent 90% of the land. But it was a little disappointing not to win at least one of those suburban districts. We had two excellent, as far as I could tell, candidates in Kendall Qualls and Tyler Kistner. And Kistner came fairly close, but Qualls lost by almost 10 points, maybe. To Dean Phillips, I believe you wouldn't call him a radical, but certainly a liberal Democrat in a district that had Republicans representing it. The Twin Cities, we're not going to even go there as far as the actual urban core of the Twin Cities. But I'm still disappointed that the Republican Party hasn't won a statewide race since I've lived here. And I believe it could be even 10 or 12 years since we won a statewide race. And that would include governor.
14 years, yeah.
14 years, Secretary of State,
okay.
U.S.
Tim
Senate.
Plenty.
Yes.
Right. So Karen Housley lost 2 years ago to Tina Smith. And then this year, Jason Lewis, who's a totally different candidate, I would say, than Karen Housley, also lost. I don't know what the middle ground would be to defeat Tina Smith. She's not a very impressive senator to me, doesn't do much, knee-jerk liberal, but she's also not as strong as Amy Klobuchar. So I would have liked to have seen us do better there and, get the governor's house back. It's all great to keep the House, absolutely. Keep the Senate and pick up seats in the House and pick up U.S. congressional seats. But man, it would be nice to live in a state that not only could win statewide, but isn't the state with the longest drought without electing a Republican, which goes back to 72, I believe. We're at 50 years since our state has voted for a Republican president. And, we're not Massachusetts or Maryland or Vermont, but gosh, they've elected Republican statewide much more recently.
We did have one question. Thank you, AJ. We did have one question that came in the chat area, and we want to pick up on that. And the question was, so where are the Republicans with the backbone? And I don't know if there's any ones that you've seen that really stand out to say that represent we the people out there, but I'll just throw that out to either one of you that want to respond to the Republicans with the backbone. Oh, it's really quiet.
That's the entire question. Where are the Republicans with the backbone?
It's really kind of asking the question. I would say that it's more relative to, I think Brandon kind of talked about a little bit earlier in saying somebody needs to be able to put a stake in the ground and be able to claim this. And so ask where are the Republicans fighting for we the people? Where are the Republicans with a backbone?
Well, I'll illustrate an issue with the general modus operandi of Republicans and mainline Republicans, both in Minnesota and in the Beltway environment. I'll just use the lockdowns, for example, the COVID lockdowns. Our base, by and large, is opposed to the economic shutdowns, the social restrictions, so on and so forth. And yet we really have virtually no Republicans, with the exception of maybe State Senator Scott Jensen, who's, I think, done a nice
Steve
job.
Drazkowski, yeah.
Drazkowski, I think Representative-elect Eric Mortensen, speaking of a suburban district that we actually did win in the Shakopee area, went Republican, beat a popular mayor in Representative Tabke, former mayor of Shakopee. Has actually spoken out against the inhumane societally detrimental effects of the COVID-19 lockdown. And Governor Walz has basically been able to completely articulate in an unopposed manner his program for this policy, all the while tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and by extension really millions of Minnesotans, if you include the school closures and things of that nature, have had their lives upended. In our Republican response post-election was to not bring it up in the following special session because people didn't want to talk about it. The Republican response, even of late, is, well, maybe we should scale back on, this nuanced policy item of the emergency order or that, rather than coming out forcefully and addressing the issue and just saying, look, we're opposed to it based on the fact that, A, it's destroying our economy, it's destroying countless children's lives and educational opportunities, and it's destroying businesses that will never, ever come back. And you just don't hear that enough. There are some, like I said, I think Congresswoman-elect Fishbach has had some strong statements since she's been elected. I think, like I said, Representative-elect Mortensen out of Shakopee has done a nice job. State Senator Jensen has done a nice job, but there aren't enough. And it's because
right.
the general footing of conservatives, again, has always been to sort of react to whatever the Democrats are doing, rather than putting out an affirmative position that forces them to take a defensive posture. And I think it's generally a concern across the board. When are we going to throw the counterpunch? I think is when.
Who's going to lead that?
Right, exactly. And I understand the sentiment.
AJ, a response to that, Republicans with the backbone, where are they?
Well, I appreciate that Branden served in the state and state government. Obviously you have to elect certain people that represent your district. It's a lot easier if you represent a 80% Republican district to have certain views than if you're
and to see those views.
Suburban district. Democrats would probably have the same complaint about their politicians. I think it's just natural in politics to say, why don't we fight? Where's the backbone? Both sides have their populist side due to that. And when it comes to COVID, I totally agree. It's been a disaster in terms of the shutdowns, and I don't see that we've made any more progress. I realize there's science and medical issues involved, but Minnesota doesn't have fewer deaths per capita than anywhere else because we've had more shutdowns than they have in South Dakota or Iowa. So it's schools reopening is something that is paramount, and I could argue they never should have.
You want
closed.
to talk about an issue that conservative women care about, suburban women
Absolutely.
care about,
Everyone. I mean, if you look
women
at
in general care about. I mean,
right.
It's not strictly abortion and education funding. We're talking, and that's where we need to just entirely change our mindset and start to think in an offensive manner. And I think that's what the questioner is probably getting to.
Right. One of the things I'm going to jump to is kind of, so where does the Republican Party go? And I think the crux of that issue is really the Twin Cities. And there are 1 million internationals, first and second generation, in the Twin Cities. And that's how, that's basically 1 in 3 now are first or second generation immigrants in the Twin Cities. And how do Republicans reach that group? Because if you're not able to reach that group, I believe that this state will never be red. So AJ, you go first here on this one.
Well, are you looking at it nationally, how Republicans reach it for presidential and U.S. Senate elections, or specifically
No.
Minnesota state government races?
Minnesota state government and how that reflects even to on the national elections from senators here from Minnesota.
Well, these districts are 80-20 districts. It's going to take a long time to change them. Like any other urban area, urban people vote Democrat, whether they're white, black, brown, whatever it might be. There's a million reasons for that. I don't necessarily believe that all these communities are socially conservative. Some of them are socially liberal. They just are. Not, and that doesn't have to do with race. It's where you live and what you see and how you interact. There's been a thought that amongst Republicans for generations that Hispanics are socially conservative, blacks are socially conservative. Yeah, they might be a little more socially conservative than whites as a whole. We know the whole woke culture is pretty much being supported by rich white progressives. I do realize that, but it's difficult. The economic side is what I would look at more than anything. And I'm sure Branden would agree that lower taxes, fewer regulations, just giving people a chance to be free to pursue their goals, whether it's in business or education or what have you, and the schools. It may never work. It may take 50 years, but we also know the parties, 50 years ago looked different than they do now. I mean, the parties 5 years ago looked differently. To be honest, did anyone talk about populism on the right before Donald Trump came around? That's a whole different discussion about how quickly this came about. But there are aspects of the working class push that probably do appeal to people in the cities. The other hand, like I said, it's going to take a long time. I think we started by talking about the percentage of votes that the president got from communities of color. And I'm sure Minnesota wasn't that different than Georgia or New York. But, to get ecstatic about getting 12% of the black vote and 32% of the Latino vote, George W. Bush actually got 44% of the Hispanic vote, and Reagan got something like that too. So we've still got ways to go. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, since my wife is from Colombia, that Latinos are different all around the world. Mexican Americans, Colombian, Puerto Rican. We saw how different Florida votes than California.
Right.
And how Texas votes differently than New York. So that's a long way of saying that I'm not overly sanguine that the Twin Cities are going to be turning red anytime soon, but I'd like to think we can get enough voters from that area that it can at least turn the state a little bit more purplish red as a whole.
Okay. Branden, go ahead, please.
Well, I think you talked about, demographics, and demographics are critically important in politics. They say a lot and they have a huge impact. And I mentioned it earlier, and actually AJ sort of helped lead into my point here when he talked about the 12% vote for Trump with the black community and 33% with the Latino community. The fact of the matter is, in Minnesota, again, 10% of, let's just say 70% of the population is more than 10% of the 30%, right? So,
fair point. Yep.
So there's so much, the consultancy class, and particularly the St. Paul adjacent GOP, loves to talk about outreach this, outreach that. We need to bring this person into the fold that's a non-traditional Republican, or that person. But what we really need to do, in the greatest number of votes, is we need to focus on in reach. There are many more votes in communities that are traditionally culturally aligned with Republicans in our own backyard than there are in reaching into these communities. I mean, I think AJ spoke to that, in the sense that it's a lost, it's very difficult to reach into these communities and expect that you're going to win them over, and particularly without alienating the people who are in your natural backyard, right?
Well,
So
but
that's
I would
critically important.
push into that a little bit, though, Branden, because we saw a CLO who emerged out of the Hmong community step forward and be endorsed by the Republicans for the 4th Congressional District. Now, he did some missteps relative to what took place in the primary, but in my conversation with him, you saw a strong affinity for Republicans and for Republicans finally reaching out and embracing him. So I think that there are some of those communities that are very open to that, to be receptive within the Republican Party.
It's not, but at the end of the day, Republicans have the natural constituency in the state of Minnesota to pull more votes out of their traditional communities than they do in reaching for communities. That's not mutually exclusive with your point.
Correct. Right.
Of course, there are people in those communities who we can reach, and we should have candidates in those local districts that help us get that message across. But we can't do it at the expense
That's
of
fair.
constituencies that are in our own group, because we can't afford to lose them either. And that's often the trade-off that people, well, we want you to moderate on this, that, or social issue, Gary. You've heard it a million times.
Oh, yes.
So in what happens is you end up pulling in a few of the other group, and you end up alienating people who would have voted for you in the first place. Right. And so we can't have that. And we spoke to an issue that really is relevant to everybody, and it's come through in public polling, whether you're Black, Latino, whatever minority community, white, etc., is the law and order message. I mean, when Black people were polled in these communities that were largely affected by lawlessness, they overwhelmingly supported an increase in police presence. Latinos the same way, and frankly, I don't think that President Trump and Republican lawmakers across the country did enough to ensure that those communities were brought back to order. Right. At the end of the day, if your property and your person isn't safe, there is no more important issue to you politically.
Right. AJ, you wanted to say something.
No, I totally agree on the law enforcement. That was one of those things that maybe it happened too late in the cycle because it happened in the summer. But what we saw in Minneapolis, and the disrespect for law enforcement and the destruction and the violence and the totally inept and incompetent response from the mayor, the city council, and the governor, boy, you'd think that would have pushed more people to vote for Republican candidates in the Twin Cities or in the suburbs. I mean, the fact that we couldn't win in the suburbs in the U.S. House races surprised me a little bit, because people there don't want to have that happen in their suburbs. They don't want to have it happen anywhere, but much less close to them. So, yeah. And as far as turning out the greater Minnesotans, I'd have to look, but it didn't seem to me like Lewis or Trump performed quite as well in the Iron Range and in parts of Western Minnesota as I thought they would. I'm sure they won, but it wasn't by
the overwhelming margins.
Yeah, and that's why you lose a state by 100,000 votes or 50,000 votes or whatever it might have been. So you're
white working class people in Anoka County was a huge miss. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm just reiterating your point.
Well, gentlemen, though, I just final point, AJ, final point, we need to wrap up here. And so any final points before we leave off? Your turn, AJ.
Just looking at the national picture, I think it's going to be really interesting. I think what happens in Georgia, I know we're not going to talk about it today, but whether the Republican Party controls the Senate or it's 50-50 with she who shall not be named casting the deciding votes is going to determine a lot of what happens with the candidates for 2024, because, whether or not Donald Trump or Donald Trump Jr. run, or Josh Hawley on a more populist ticket, or Nikki Haley or Marco Rubio or someone like that runs on a more traditionally conservative or a blend of populism, that's going to be interesting, because Trump's legacy depends on the GOP controlled Senate. And if we lose that, and he's seen as maybe even a culprit in that because he's talking so much about other issues right now, I don't know the Republicans will get behind him as easily, or his message in 2024, as they would if we control the Senate and can keep Trump era policies, if you will, in play for the next 2 to 4 years. So it's going to be fascinating, and especially in the next few weeks.
Very good. Thank you, AJ. Branden, last comments?
I said it before, a nation exists for the benefit of its own people. And our nation today is faced with an unprecedented challenge, one of the largest wealth redistributions from the middle class to the oligarchy that we've ever seen as a result of these COVID shutdowns. We've seen $200 billion in increased wealth for some of the wealthiest people and corporations in this country. And the political party that is able to capture in attempt to rectify and deal with that issue over the next 4 years, I believe is going to be the party that has success. And I think that's right in line with the economic populist message and nationalist message that Donald Trump got started in 2016. I think, quite frankly, he lost because he didn't deliver on the economic populist message and focused too much on those who have high stock holdings and were interested in tax cuts. I think that our party needs to focus on how do we bring back a viable living and a viable future for the middle class who has taken an absolute beating over the last 10 months. And I think if we can do that, if we can stay true to our American identity, our cultural identity, our social identity, I think we will have a strong coalition. And by the way, Donald Trump is far and away the front runner for 2024 if he's not elected in 2020. I saw a Morning Consult poll yesterday that if you combine his numbers with Mike Pence and Donald Trump Jr., which I all put in the same category, he's at 73% for the Republican nomination. So this is Trump's party. There is no post-Trump era. Trump is just as much of an influence today as he's ever been.
Well, gentlemen,
and that's
very good. Thank you very much, Branden Petersen and AJ Kaufman. We thank you for that. Again, this is Gary Borgendale, and guest hosting sitting in this afternoon for Alpha News and First Tuesday Conservatives as we talk about the forum. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you being with us. And just a reminder that on December 17th, Ed Morrissey and I will be back, and we will be talking about the integrity of the elections here in Minnesota and across the country. So we'll still continue to have that unfold before we and Ed and I talk about that. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to AJ. Thank you for Branden. Happy Hanukkah to you, AJ. Merry Christmas to the rest of our audience out there. And thank you very much and have a good night.
Thanks much.
Thank you.